Good evening. I am James Evans. I am the Chief Executive Officer of the Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation, and I want to welcome everyone to our annual Everglades update in partnership with the Everglades Foundation. We're very excited tonight to have with us Dr. Steve Davis, who is the Chief Science Officer for the Everglades Foundation. And we also have Tate, I'm going to hopefully get your name right here, Tate Vangelo, who is the coordinator for Southwest Florida, education coordinator for Southwest Florida. So Tate, thank you for being here tonight. Again, before we get started, I do want to recognize a couple of our Board of Trustees that are here. We have our President of the Board, Don Rice, sitting right here in the third row. Don, mind raising your hand? Thank you very much, and his wife, Joyce. Means you have to set the wine down for a minute. And we also have Ann Nobles, who is sitting here in the front row. Ann, thank you for being here tonight. And I also want to recognize our elected officials, and I believe we only have one tonight. We have Councilmember John Henshaw. John, where are you? Right there. Excellent. Thank you for being here tonight. Just real quick, I just want to talk about the importance of partnerships. As we work on the water quality issues that we work on here on Sanibel and Captiva Islands, whether it's our coastal waters, or the Equalization estuary, our regional partnerships are absolutely critical to be able to protect what we care about here on Sanibel and Captiva Islands. If we only focused on our two islands, we would miss all of those things that are directly impacting our quality of life, our local economy, and the ecology of our waters. And of course, we are directly tied to the Everglades ecosystem. We're considered what's called the northern estuaries. The Equalization and St. Lucie estuaries make up the northern estuaries. So, you know, these partnerships that we have with the Everglades Foundation or with the Conservancy of Southwest Florida or the partnerships that we have with the Captains for Clean Water and others on the East Coast, those are critical to be able to protect the resources that we care about here on our island. So I think that's just important to point out, you know, why we partner, why these strategic partnerships are just so important. So what I'm planning to do tonight is, what I want to do is kind of give you a real quick overview of the Everglades ecosystem and talk a little bit about the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan. But first, before I do that, I want to introduce our panelists and kind of lay out how the program is going to go tonight. So after I introduce the panelists tonight, I'm going to provide a real high-level overview, provide a little bit of a historical perspective, and talk about the goals of the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan. Our panelists will each be given 15 minutes to present on different parts of the system. And then when we conclude with that, I will ask a few pre-prepared questions to the panel. And then we will allow some questions from the live audience, and then we will also allow our virtual audience, who is attending by Zoom tonight, to also ask some questions. And those of you that are attending by Zoom, I would ask that you submit your questions via the question and answer feature. It should be located at the bottom of the screen, but it depends on which device you're using. So anyway, appreciate all of you attending tonight. And I just want to read the bios of our participants here. We've got Dr. Steve Davis. Steve Davis is the Everglades Foundation's Chief Science Officer. A native of Ohio, he earned his PhD from Florida International University in 1999 with research in Florida Bay and the coastal Everglades. Steve joined the Everglades Foundation in 2009 as a member of the science department, and he became a key voice in support of the organization's mission to restore America's Everglades. He draws upon his 25 years of Everglades science and teaching experience, including 10 years as a professor of wetland ecology at Texas A&M University, to lead science, communication, and outreach efforts focused on Everglades restoration, ecosystem health, and the impacts of sea level rise. Can we all give Steve a hand? Thank you. We also have with us tonight Dr. Paul Julian. Paul Julian was hired by SECF in partnership with the Conservancy of Southwest Florida in March of this past year. We're excited to have Paul with us tonight. It's actually been close to a year now that you've been with us. Excellent. Glad to have you, Paul. Paul's a wetland biogeochemist and a hydrologic modeler, working as part of a partnership between SECF and the Conservancy. And his work focuses on linking biogeochemical and hydrological processes on a landscape scale with an emphasis on wetland and lake ecosystems. He has been involved with Everglades restoration efforts and research for the past decade, contributing to the evaluation of ecosystem restoration efforts. Everybody give Paul a hand. Thank you. We're super excited to have both of you with us tonight. Again, I'm James Evans. I'm the CEO of SECF, and just to give you a little background on me, I've been working on the island here on Sanibel and Captiva Islands for the past 22 years or so. I spent the first part of my career working for the city of Sanibel, starting off as a conservation officer in 2000 and working my way up to the director of natural resources, where I spent 7 years before I joined SECF and became the environmental policy director, where I tried to fill the shoes of Rayanne Wessel, who was the past policy director, and then, of course, moved up to the CEO position this past January. So super excited to be here tonight. I've worked on Everglades restoration issues for the past 20 years, along with my colleagues here. We're super excited to present this program to you tonight. And I just want to, we'll go ahead and kick it off with a little bit of an overview of Everglades restoration. So I want to do kind of an Everglades Restoration 101. Most of you know what the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan is. It was a plan that was adopted and authorized by Congress in 2000 in what's called the WRDA bill, Water Resources Development Act bill. In that authorization, there was a suite of projects. There were 68 projects in the entire Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan, but of course, all of those projects weren't authorized at the time that bill was approved by Congress. So what we do is we authorize these projects as they're ready to be rolled out. And it's usually based on a priority, and I'll talk about what's called the Integrated Delivery Schedule, which is the schedule that the Army Corps of Engineers and the South Florida Water Management Districts uses to schedule these projects and roll these projects out as funding becomes available. But the Everglades, of course, the Historical Everglades was called the River of Grass, remains the River of Grass, and the headwaters of the River of Grass started just south of Orlando in an area called Shingle Creek. Historically, the Everglades would move south through the Kissimmee floodplain into Lake Okeechobee and south into the Historical Everglades as it moved south into the Central Everglades and out into Florida Bay. Today, of course, that system has been significantly altered because of land use changes and the ditching and draining of the system, and I'll go into that in a minute. But when you look at the maps here, starting from left to right, you'll see a map of the Historical Everglades. You can see that slew of water that moved through that central portion of the system, and of course, Steve will provide you a little more detail on that. As you move from left to right, you'll see that map in the middle. That's our current flows. You can see that the system is very much ditched and drained. The majority of the flows now go east and west to the Caloosahatchee and the St. Lucie on the east, with very little water actually making its way into the Everglades. Of course, that's resulted in a number of impacts to the ecosystem, but the flows that are being diverted east and west to the estuaries also create some significant problems, which I'll touch on here shortly. But our goal with the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan is to restore the quality, quantity, timing, and distribution of those flows so that we can get the water right. It's about getting the water right in the Everglades to restore that ecosystem, and also to get that water right in what's called the northern estuaries, the Caloosahatchee and St. Lucie estuaries, and also to get that water south into Florida Bay, where it can help to balance the salinity, where we've seen significant impacts over the last several decades. And so, the Everglades isn't just the River of Grass. It makes up a very large network of different ecosystems, from the cypress swamps and the Big Cypress to of course, the sawgrass sloughs that run through the Central Everglades, to Lake Okeechobee, the beating heart of the Everglades system, and the northern estuaries, and north, of course, to the Kissimmee River and floodplain. And of course, the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan goals will help to restore the entire system, not just the River of Grass. And so, of course, we know that it's not just about restoring these ecosystems, but it's also about restoring the economic viability of our state. More than 9 million people depend on water as part of this system. The Everglades also provides important ecosystem services to people living along the coast, also provides important water supply for agriculture and urban uses, as well as habitat for a lot of these critters you see in these pictures, from our oyster reefs to our seagrasses, which support our world-class fisheries and our coral reefs along the East Coast. They also provide an abundance of wading birds that bring in people from all over the world for bird watching, and again, we depend on these systems. We all know that. And of course, when we have these major discharges that come from Lake Okeechobee or Caloosahatchee Watershed, that has a direct impact on our natural systems, but it also impacts our quality of life and our local economy. And so these systems have been significantly altered from their natural state, beginning back as far as the 1800s. In the early 1800s, 1882, a developer from Philadelphia named Hamilton Diston made the first changes to the system, where he purchased 4 million acres from the state of Florida at 25 cents per acre, and started his dredging into the Caloosahatchee, connecting the Caloosahatchee with Lake Okeechobee. That was the first connection. The Caloosahatchee was never naturally connected to Lake Okeechobee. It wasn't until Hamilton Diston made that direct connection and forever changed the hydrology of the Caloosahatchee. He then went into the Kissimmee River and made some connections, helping to straighten the Kissimmee and making direct connections, getting that water off the landscape to help drain the land. Essentially, he was the first one to start draining the swamp, so to speak. And of course, that have major implications as we move forward. So all of the ditching and draining that has occurred over the past century, beginning with Hamilton Diston, and then, of course, being carried forward by the Army Corps of Engineers, has had a direct impact on our water management system. And the images on the right-hand side of the screen there, you'll see those are the changes that have occurred since 1911 to 1970. And you can see the changes to Lake Okeechobee. Essentially what happened in the starting in the early 1900s and into the 30s, when the Herbert Hoover Dike was authorized by Congress, the lake was contained. So that essentially reduced the volume of water where the lake used to spread out over this massive ecosystem. The lake now has these walls that contain the water, which has, of course, made water management very challenging within the South Florida ecosystem. And, of course, one of the major drivers for changes in this water management system were the 1926 and 1928 hurricanes, which resulted in over 2,500 people losing their lives as a result of the hurricanes that hit Pahokee, South Bay, and Clewiston in 26 and 28. That was really the catalyst for the Herbert Hoover Dike, which was authorized in 1930 and, of course, completed in 1937. And that image on the lower right there, you can see that was some of the devastation that occurred and to the communities around Lake Okeechobee. Following the construction of the Herbert Hoover Dike, we had the Army Corps of Engineers authorized what's called the Central and Southern Florida Project. That was a project that was authorized in the Flood Control Act of 1948. What that did was turned over the authority for water management from the state of Florida to the Army Corps of Engineers. And of course, we operate under the Central and Southern Florida Project today. And of course, as we're developing the Lake Okeechobee System Operating Manual, the new Lake Okeechobee Schedule, which you'll hear about in a few minutes here, the Central and Southern Florida Project, which is a flood control project, is really what kind of ties the hands of the water managers and the Army Corps of Engineers on what we can and can't do as part of the new regulation schedule. So we have to uphold those values that were adopted in 1948. And so, of course, those alterations that have occurred to the landscape had direct impacts on our ecosystems. It, of course, not only redirected flows to the coast, but it also reduced the amount of water that was going south into the Everglades. That directly resulted in reducing the flows. That resulted in the dry out of the peat soils south of Lake Okeechobee, which you'll hear about from Dr. Steve Davis here in a minute. It also changed the delivery of water to the Everglades and Florida Bay, which of course had direct impacts on the bay and the salinities. But it also opened up the Everglades agricultural area for development. And of course, as part of that development and the production of sugar and other agricultural products within the Everglades agricultural area, that took away essentially 50% of the historical Everglades. And that has, of course, had a direct impact on our water quality and the water quantity, and of course, hinders the way we manage the water management system moving forward. And so, of course, you all are familiar with all of the harmful algal blooms that have impacted the Caloosahatchee. Raise your hand if you were here in 2005 for the red drift algae that washed up on our beaches. Okay, we have a few of you. So that image on the upper left-hand corner, that was the direct result of major releases from Lake Okeechobee that added nutrients that fueled these harmful algal blooms. Of course, in 2016 and 2018, you probably remember those blooms as well, where we had blue-green algae covering more than 70 miles of the Caloosahatchee, which also contributed to a massive red tide bloom, which killed thousands and thousands of pounds of dead marine life that washed up on our beaches. The city of Sanibel removed about 850,000 pounds of dead marine life at a cost of about $1.6 million. And the Sanibel Captiva Chamber of Commerce reported an economic impact in 2018 of about $47 million. So these water management issues have a direct impact on our local economy and our quality of life. And of course, it's not just when we get too much water, it's also when we don't get enough water. We call this the Caloosahatchee conundrum because during the dry season, because of the way the system's been altered, we don't receive enough water. And during the wet season, we're trying to get water out of Lake Okeechobee and we receive too much water. And of course, when we receive too much water, that results in these harmful algal blooms, and of course, the dark water plume that extends miles out into the Gulf of Mexico. But during the dry season, you may not see it here along the coast, but we see direct impacts to the estuary. We see very elevated salinities. The salt content in the water goes up. It has impacts on our submerged aquatic vegetation like tape grass in the upper estuary, where we've lost almost 1,000 acres of tape grass, important habitat for our fish and invertebrates that live in the estuary. But anyway, I'll leave that to our scientists here tonight, but I just kind of wanted to set the stage a little bit for some of the impacts that we've experienced and how important this system is and how connected we are to the Everglades ecosystem. And again, it's all about restoring the quality, quantity, timing, and distribution of flows to these natural systems. And of course, I mentioned earlier when I started off this talk, the projects that are part of the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan are going to be critical to restoring the freshwater flows. And these projects are phased in through what's called the Integrated Delivery Schedule. This is a schedule that's put together by the Army Corps of Engineers and the South Forward Management District that sets up a plan for funding. Originally, when the Everglades Restoration Plan was authorized, I believe it was an $8 billion project. And today, it's upwards of $24 billion. That's billion with a B. So it's going to be critical to get these projects done as quickly as possible. And right now, this integrated delivery schedule goes out to about 2032. We hope to get some of these important projects done over the next couple of years. And you'll hear about the C-43 Reservoir that will be coming online here pretty soon. And you'll hear about the keystone project of Everglades Restoration, which is the Everglades Agricultural Area Reservoir, which is going to be really important for storing, treating, and conveying that water south into the Everglades. But with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Steve Davis so that he can talk a little bit about restoring America's Everglades. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you for teeing this up, James, and thank you for the invitation to come here. This is quite a delightful place. I mentioned earlier that I want to set up my tent out there in the lawn and just camp out here for a few days. So we're the Everglades Foundation. We've been in existence for 29 years. Next year will be our 30th year. And we were formed in response to a similar kind of water crisis, but one that took place in Florida Bay. And it was a result of not enough fresh water getting through the Everglades down to the Florida Keys. And the situation of hypersalinity developed to the point where it was lethal for the seagrass. And upwards of 100,000 acres of Florida Bay seagrass was impacted. Many of those areas went completely belly up. So our co-founders engaged science from the very beginning to understand the cause of the problem. And the more they looked into it, the more they realized it was tied in with this greater water management problem that we have in South Florida that ultimately led to the comprehensive Everglades restoration plan that James described it. When most people think of Everglades restoration, they think of this image, you know, the river of grass. It's about the river of grass. It's actually so much more when you think of the Caloosahatchee problem, when you think of the St. Lucie, Lake Okeechobee, Kissimmee River. But it's Everglades restoration because it's ultimately putting the water back where it belongs, sending it south. That resolves many of our problems. And so we didn't have a satellite in the 1800s, but if we did, it would look like that image on the left. And so when you're thinking of Marjorie Stoneman Douglas and her book, The River of Grass, that ecosystem 50 to 60 miles wide with a sheet of water flowing very slowly from the southern rim of Lake Okeechobee all the way down to the tip of the peninsula. That's what that ecosystem was once like. And it was only that narrow white ridge along the Lower East Coast where people were developing because it wasn't flooded for half of the year. So what we're left with, and James described this, is a ecosystem that was half its original size, it's compartmentalized, and it's disconnected from its headwaters, Lake Okeechobee. So we have that large agricultural area now south of the lake, farming sugar primarily on former Everglades peat soils. And because of all of these changes and the dredging that James described, and later the Central and Southern Florida project that gave us this water management infrastructure that the South Florida Water Management District manages today, we have this system that's gone from a very continually flowing system from south of Orlando down to Florida Bay to one that's now disconnected and redirected in a very unnatural way, to the point where the naturally functioning area of the Everglades is south of Tamiami Trail in Everglades National Park. The problem is it doesn't get but about half or less of the water that it used to receive. And of course, those unwanted massive volume discharges going east and west. And so the restoration plan that James described, it's really about infrastructure, massive water infrastructure projects. The one in the upper left is the C-43 Reservoir. That's a 10,000 acre footprint of a reservoir. You could fit Chicago's O'Hare Airport and Miami International Airport into that footprint. That gives you a size of the scale of that reservoir project. The upper middle project is the C-44. That's the analogous reservoir that was just completed along the St. Lucie Canal. That reservoir is filling up today, and collectively those projects will help to restore that timing and hopefully quality of water that these estuaries need to have. Of course, there are other projects like the bridges along Tamiami Trail to help us get more water south into Everglades National Park. And what these images should really show you is that we need this infrastructure in order to restore the functionality of South Florida. And that's largely the Everglades and our estuaries. So in a sense, these infrastructure projects are prostheses that allow us to hold water, to pull from that when we need it during the dry season, in some ways to allow us to move water from one area to another, that these structures along the lower edge of this slide show. So Everglades is really water infrastructure, but it's essential, not just for the health of the environment, it's really essential for our state's economy. One of the key projects that's come out of this restoration plan that's actually moving along is the Central Everglades Plan. And this is a collection of those CERP projects that James was describing. There are 68 of them. They bundled a handful of those and called it the Central Everglades Plan. And this project basically extends from the southern rim of Lake Okeechobee down to Everglades National Park. And it really helps us to move more water south. And more water south basically means less of that unwanted water going east and west to the Caloosahatchee and to the St. Lucie. So this is a project that's moving along, but the key component of that Central Everglades plan is the EAA reservoir. James mentioned this earlier. In the map on the right, it's the project in red. It has both a 10,000 acre footprint of a reservoir as well as a 6,500 acre stormwater treatment marsh. And that helps us to ensure that we're getting clean water flowing south rather than sending polluted lake water or polluted ag runoff to the Everglades. This is also a very large project footprint. You could fit Manhattan in this project footprint. It's that large. But again, the idea is to take water from the lake, store it, clean it, and send it south. So in a way, it functions like a rain barrel. If you've got a rain barrel tied into your downspout, you pull water from the lake when it's in abundance, when you would otherwise be sending that to the Caloosahatchee and St. Lucie. You pass it through that treatment marsh, and you're ensuring that you send clean water all the way down to Everglades National Park. We're making progress on this project. The limitation is funding. It's a $3 billion plus project. We know that it's worth it. It's just getting the political will and primarily the federal dollars to build this project. But when it's complete, we'll see a 55% reduction in those discharges and 120 billion gallons of new water flowing south, clean water flowing south to Everglades National Park. So as James said, this is really the keystone project for Everglades restoration. These treatment marshes, if you look at them from above, they just look like a large wetland. They're converted ag fields that are flooded, managed, vegetated to remove phosphorus pollution from that water, again, that's coming out of the lake, that's coming off those sugar fields, so that we're not sending polluted water south. This aerial photograph I took is of a flow equalization basin. It's another type of treatment wetland, but that's looking south down Highway 27 toward the water conservation areas and toward Broward County, if you're familiar with that area. Of course, the plumbing to get that water moving through the ecosystem and down into Everglades National Park are the bridges along Tamiami Trail. We have 3.3 miles of bridges. The final phase of this project is ongoing right now, where they're basically pulling out the old road bed and building a new road higher with additional box culverts to help us get more water south. And the key to getting more water south is being able to raise water levels in the marshes and in the canals. And this project will be completed in July 24 and will really help us to get restoration quantities of flow south. And for those of us that live along the lower East Coast, whether you're in Broward County, Miami-Dade County, even the Florida Keys, all the way down to Key West, southern Palm Beach County, you get your water directly from this ecosystem. It recharges the Biscayne Aquifer that over 5 million people along the lower East Coast depend upon, as well as agriculture. South Dade Ag is a huge economic driver, and of course tourism. Think of all the hotels in Miami-Dade County, even on the beach. They're getting their water from underneath the Everglades. Keeping this ecosystem hydrated is essential to protecting the habitats and the wildlife that we associate with the Everglades. But it's also essential to protecting the foundation of the Everglades, and that is the peat soils. Organic soils that these wetlands produce and accumulate over centuries. It is essential for the habitat. It's also essential to keeping the carbon that's sequestered in those soils over thousands of years in some cases. But when you dry out the Everglades, you lose those soils. You lose the carbon back out to the atmosphere. You lose the habitats. And so keeping this ecosystem hydrated, we know, is essential to protecting both habitats and carbon that's tied up in them. Those habitats are things like tree islands, sawgrass ridges, and sloughs. And of course, it's essential to protecting that topographic variation. The tree islands are slightly higher elevation, the sloughs are the lowest in elevation. And that's important for the ecological function of this system. It's also quite beautiful when you look at it from above. this patterned landscape of tree islands, teardrop-shaped features that have formed over hundreds of years to thousands of years with that very slow sheet flow of water. And ultimately, it's getting water south to where it needs to go. The finish line is Florida Bay and the massive mangrove coast of the coastal Everglades, and getting the fresh water down to that estuary that's needed to protect our mangroves and to protect the seagrasses that obviously species like manatee depend on directly, but there are a variety of other small fish and shellfish that depend on this for food and for refuge. And so this is really, for us, the finish line of success with Everglades restoration. If we can solve the Florida Bay problem, going back to the origins of our organization, if we can solve the Florida Bay problem, that means we've solved all the problems upstream. Thank you.
That's a tough act to follow. All right, so hello everyone. So I'm going to actually talk a little bit about the specific projects that are in the Lake Okeechobee Northern Estuaries area. So as James mentioned, the Lake Okeechobee is the liquid heart of the Everglades. And here's an animation showing as the lake fills up and drains, it looks like a heart beating. And as that water reaches high level, the lake is completely quote unquote full, and there's hypothetically a sheet of water across the whole ecosystem. And as that draws down, wetlands become exposed, and that's essential habitat for fish and birds. So we want to kind of protect and preserve this and restore this part of the system so that way the Everglades can thrive more so than it is today. And so to do that, we have the first kind of project is the Lake Okeechobee System Operating Manual, which James introduced a little bit. And he also mentioned the Water Resources Development Act of 2000, which authorized the Everglades restoration, but part of it also authorized establishing a regulation schedule of how we manage the water in the lake. And so ultimately, right now, what we're doing is we're developing a new operating schedule for the Lake Okeechobee. So we have a plan that we're currently under, and we're trying to bolster it a little bit, make it a little bit better for the estuaries and the lake, and moving more water south. And ultimately, what we want to do is incorporate flexibility while balancing what we need to do, regulatorily, or what Congress said we have to do. And so this is kind of a plot or a picture of what the quote-unquote regulation schedule looks like today. There's a lot of lines and a lot of letters and stuff like that, so don't look too much into that. But ultimately what it is a prescription of if the lake is at a particular spot, this is what we have to do ultimately. And so that's what we have today, and we're going to change it to something that looks a little bit different. And that change provides about 81% certainty of when the Caloosahatchee Estuary is going to receive water. We don't know necessarily what the volume is, but we know that we're going to get it at least 81% of the time. And some of those discharges are good and needed for the health of the estuary. We get in this new plan, we get an improved optimal flow and a decrease in stress and damaging. So that means we're kind of fostering that healthy ecology of the system. Only bad part is that every once in a while we get the act of God events like hurricanes or just high water, and so that means we get the brunt of the extreme flows every once in a while. And of course, the other issue with the new plan is it keeps the lake just a tiny bit higher than it probably should from an ecological standpoint, but the benefits that are achieved are essentially balanced on the back of the lake. Moving into the next kind of CERT project, we have the Lake Okeechobee Watershed Restoration Plan. There's going to be a quiz after this, by the way. So this project is a CERT project that's specific to establishing infrastructure north of the lake. And that infrastructure is primarily to improve the water levels within the lake, so as we manage the lake up and down, improve the quantity and timing of discharges to our northern estuaries, so to us and to the St. Lucie estuary primarily. It's also to improve water supply for the Lake Okeechobee service area, and also to increase the spatial extent and functionality of wetlands within that northern portion of the lake. And so back in mid-2018, 2019, the planning team associated with this project that included us, Army Corps of Engineers, South Florida Water Management District, and others, kind of put together this plan and said, this is it. This is what we're going to do, guys. What do you think? We're going to have a wetland attenuation feature, which is going to provide so much storage. We're going to have a bunch of aquifer storage and recovery wells, and we're going to restore a bunch of wetlands. A couple stakeholders saw that and said, I don't like it that much. We have issues, as you would expect, right? And so in late 2020, we monkeyed things around a little bit. And we took away that wetland attenuation feature, which was a really important component of this project that would store a lot of water and restore a lot of wetlands at the same time. So in this revised plan, what we really wanted to expect, or what we wanted, was to improve the water levels in the lake and improve our quantity, timing, and, of discharges to our northern estuaries. What we get ultimately is more frequent high stages, so we keep the lake a little bit higher than we probably want to. And that dot in the middle, in case you're colorblind, is red, which meaning that's not good. For the Caloosahatchee, we want to improve our quantity, timing, and distribution of discharges, but we don't really get that for our side of the coast. We have an increase in low flow events, which is bad for the ecology of the system. We don't get really good optimum flows, and we get a lot more stressful and damaging. So you can imagine that if you only got a little bit of oxygen, you got only a little bit of water, and you were made to run on a treadmill for 3 hours, you wouldn't be feeling too happy, would you? And that's kind of what the Caloosahatchee is under this plan. For the St. Lucie, they actually come out of the wash pretty well, and in case you're colorblind, that last little dot is green, and where they get an improvement in optimum flows and a decrease in stress and damaging. So they fare a lot better in this plan. Let's move a little bit, I guess, in this case, west or east for us, because if you take State Road 80 towards West Palm and cross the Hendry County line, you're going to eventually come across this. Well, you probably won't see it, but that's where it's at, roughly. It's the C43 West Basin Storage Reservoir, C43 Reservoir, Caloosahatchee Reservoir. It's got about 17 different names. But ultimately, what it's supposed to do, and Steve mentioned the size of this, it's a pretty huge project, but it's supposed to capture and store stormwater runoff and kind of buffer those regulatory releases from Lake Okeechobee. Fingers crossed that everything goes right. It'll be done in mid-2024, which will be outstanding. It'll be another CERT project that's kind of done. That's going to provide benefits to the Caloosahatchee. Back in 2019, the governor issued his Executive Order 1912, which currently, as this project configured, is just a storage feature. This executive order essentially directed the Water Management District and stakeholders to kind of figure out a plan to provide water quality treatment associated with this project. And there was a feasibility and siting evaluation done, and ultimately what they came up with was a way to treat the water in the reservoir before it's discharged, and in this case it was alum treatment. Here's a couple really cool pictures sourced from Leah Reidenbach, our research associate and policy associate. She got to take a flight up across the area. The figure on the bottom left is actually if you were sitting kind of on the levee of the reservoir looking north, so you might be able to see it, might be washed out a little bit, but let's see. This right here is the Caloosahatchee as it kind of, I don't know if you can see that cursor. That's the Caloosahatchee to kind of give a little bit of perspective. And then this figure on the top right is the actual pump station that's going to take the water from the Caloosahatchee and put it into the reservoir. So that's pretty cool to get a bird's eye perspective of the project. And it by no means diminishes the size of it, because this is only a tiny little pin drop compared to what the project actually is. So I grabbed some other pictures from the South Florida Water Management District. And so this is another picture of that pump station, the inflow pump station. And that currently we're at 94% complete. So we're almost there. They're just about finished, which is great because that's a huge engineering feat there. The other part of the project that we're waiting on to get stuff done with is the embankment and perimeter canal and control structures. So essentially it's going to be about 30, 40 foot walls and that's what they got to build up. So right now they're at about 38% complete. So you can imagine building up 30 foot walls and yeah, for quite several miles on flat South Florida is pretty difficult. Steve mentioned the C-44 reservoir and STA. That's over on the St. Lucie side. We're going to take a little trip over to the East Coast. And here's the picture on the bottom right here is of when they started filling it up in early January. And ultimately what this project's supposed to do is capture and treat the Basin stormwater runoff. South Florida Water Management District constructed the STA, the treatment wetland part of it, and the district the Army Corps completed the reservoir. And so now it's an integrated unit to where they're able to capture the water, store it, treat it, and then put it out when it needs to be put out. Another project on the East Coast is the Indian River Lagoon. Indian River Lagoon South, C23-24 Reservoir and STA. I know it's a mouthful. But ultimately, so where we were just before, the C-44 reservoir is down here, if you can see the cursor here. We're going to move a little bit north and focus up here on this area. And ultimately what this project, again, surprise, surprise, is to capture, store, and treat local basin runoff. And before it gets to the St. Lucie Estuary and the southern Indian River Lagoon. And it's actually a series of reservoirs and treatment wetlands that are going to work in conjunction with each other to capture that water, treat it, and push it out the tide. And ultimately, it's the storage and treatment component of it is about 163,000 acre feet, which means probably absolutely nothing to you guys. I think it's something on the order of like 80,000 Olympic-sized swimming pools or something like that. It's actually a pretty large area. Like Steve said, these projects aren't tiny by any means. They're kind of massive engineering feats. And there's a 2,500 acre stormwater treatment area. So that's like 1,000 football fields or something like that. It's pretty massive. And actually, in February 20th, they had the groundbreaking for the stormwater treatment area portion of this project. So that they're in construction right now, ultimately, which is great. I mean, it's more progress moving forward. And I guess now is the panel discussion.
Yeah. Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Steve. Great overview of the projects that are going on in the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan. And I do want to point out, Paul didn't mention, but one of the other things that LOSOM, the Lake Okeechobee System Operating Manual, will do, it'll triple the volume of water that we send south to the Everglades. That's huge. That's going to take all of that water that would have gone east and west and send it south to the Everglades where it's desperately needed. So that's going to be a real big win if we can get that through, and the whole process isn't undermined by this Senate Bill 2508 that's lingering out there. And I've got some questions for the panel here in a second, and we'll dive into some of the politics in addition to the science. So anyway, and then I'll give everybody in the audience an opportunity to ask some questions as well. So for the panel, what project or projects will provide the greatest immediate and long-term benefits to Everglades and Everglades restoration in the northern estuaries? Start with you, Steve.
Well, get a little closer here. I think it's worth pointing out with LOSOM, this is the new rule book by which the Army Corps of Engineers will be operating Lake Okeechobee. The infrastructure that allowed for that new rule book is about a $2 billion project to reinforce Herbert Hoover Dike. So as it turns out, that infrastructure will probably yield the greatest benefit in the near term because we'll see that new rule book in use beginning in January of 2023. So we'll see more water going south, and we'll see about a 37% reduction in harmful discharges to east and west coast. So, that's fantastic. And when you add in what these other reservoirs will do in terms of improving the timing of water going east and west, in terms of allowing more water to go south, I think that over the next 5 to 10 years, those reservoirs will really come into play And I also have to mention the value of the project along Tamiami Trail. That you know, that road was constructed from Miami over to Naples in the 1920s, and here we are in the 2020s, and that road is no longer a constraint to sending water into the park. So that's a really big deal and something that we all celebrate.
Thanks, Steve. Paul, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I don't know if I have anything much to add considering you got it all. But yeah, I mean, for the most part, we have the new rule book and we have the reservoirs that are on the table being built. I think the other components that are non-SERP projects are also going to be extremely helpful. So there's the Northern Estuaries Protection Plan projects that include storage features within you know, the C40, within our watershed essentially, that will provide some more storage and treatment as well.
Yeah, Paul, you make a good point. You know, we talk about the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan and the Lake Okeechobee System Operating Manual, but we don't talk about the watershed that much. The Coosatchee watershed makes up over 1 million acres of land if you include the coastal watersheds as well. So, you know, in addition to doing all the work that we're doing on the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan, we also need to do all of this work within the watershed, in addition to the C43 reservoir, which makes up roughly 40% of the total storage that we need within the watershed. So as we move forward, you know, we're not done after we get SERP done. We actually have to do more projects within the watershed, and that's probably going to be even more challenging than SERP is. So that's something that we have to look forward to. So, all right, next question. There has been a lot of talk recently about Senate Bill 2508. Can you explain what this bill is and what it would do and how it might impact how the water management system that we have today is managed? Any takers?
Go for it.
It's a loaded question, obviously. I mean, we all want to talk about it. So, I mean, ultimately, it's the legislation that was put forward kind of, in part, ties the hands of the Water Management District to be able to manage water effectively and efficiently and ecologically soundly. And it puts the politics in the driver's seat of managing our water, which that's not what we want to do. We want to make sure that the ecology of the system is preserved and maintained to be able to go fishing if we wanted to, or go snorkeling in a seagrass bed and see all the cool things. And so that's ultimately, I think, kind of the gist of it, right? There are some revisions that are moving through, but there's still some challenging language, I guess you can call it. And ultimately, I think even the Water Management District is a little worrisome of it because they don't want to have their hands tied. And they don't want the Army Corps to be able to have their hands tied as well to be able to do their jobs. So you can fill in if you want.
I'll just add, I'll take off my science hat for a moment and just pose the question, why would anyone not be in support of reducing polluted discharges from the lake to the east and west coast? So obviously there are interests and corporations that benefit from the status quo. And that's what we're up against. And it's really the legacies of the past. It's the legacy of Florida's economy from the 20th century that was based on agriculture, that led to the drainage of the Everglades and reconnecting or disconnecting. All of this is really the past. And we know that our economy of the present day and of the future depends on our environment. It depends on water. We can't waste water. We've got to hold on to it. We've got to make sure that it's clean. We've got to send it where it needs to go. So, you know, this is really, this is legacies of the past. We work together as a team to coordinate really the actions needed to protect our water and to restore the Everglades. And this is just another example of that, you know, trying to tie, you know, an operational plan to Everglades funding. It's just, we're working together, and it takes a team to really make this happen.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, as science-based organizations, we want science and engineering to drive the process, not politics, and unfortunately, that's kind of what's happening right now. So thank you both for that question. That was great. So what impact would or will Senate bill have on the freshwater flows in the Northern Estuaries and Everglades? Will it, you know, it'll tie the hands of the water managers, but do you see, will it affect the timing, will it affect the quantity, or both?
Well, it affects the conditions really that lead to the discharge, and the current lake schedule that Paul was describing earlier, the Lake Okeechobee regulation schedule of 2008, it has a security blanket of water for the ag interests south of Lake Okeechobee. And what that means is that when water levels in the lake dip down into that security blanket zone, everything shuts off. The Clusatchee doesn't get the water that it needs to balance out salinity levels. Everglades has long been cut off at that point. So it just holds that water in the lake. Whether those users want it, need it, it just sits there. And that ultimately leads to us moving into the beginning of the wet season with a higher lake than is needed. And that usually leads to early wet season discharges that we don't want. So it's really forcing the Water Management District to tell the Corps of Engineers that we need to keep water in the lake longer and ensure that they get their water.
And then it's dumped to the estuaries.
Yeah.
Well, and then also the secondary effect of keeping that water in for too long when it doesn't need to be is the ecology of the lake gets impacted. And so then you have the bass fisheries collapse and the submerged aquatic vegetation just completely go away. And so it's a twofer, or threefer, I guess, fourfer. I mean, it's the Caloosahatchee, St. Lucie, Okeechobee, and Everglades all get, shafted to the corner, and whatever's left is for everybody else.
Excellent, thanks. All right, so we recognize that climate change is a major threat to Florida, including impacts to our natural systems, our quality of life, and the state's economy. How will Everglades restoration help make Florida more resilient to the impacts of climate change?
Can I kick off with that?
Yeah, sure. So, the biggest thing is Everglades restoration is trying to balance in that fresh water. And if we balance the fresh water correctly, the impacts of sea level rise, especially in the in the southern Everglades, will be mitigated a little bit. So as long as we have fresh water pushing, that salt water is not going to come up and essentially make our fresh water salt. And to some extent, that also can be analogous to the estuaries too. If we don't have the right flow at S79 Franklin Lock, then that saltwater wedge is going to move up and move into the freshwater portion of the lake, and there goes all our Valleson area, and there goes risking our drinking water for communities inland as well. And so it's if we don't have Everglades restoration, or even if we have a portion of Everglades restoration, we're not going to be able to build a resilient system from an ecological side, but also from a human comfortability side, if that's even a word. And so I think that it's again a twofer, right? So if we don't have it, then we're not gonna be comfortable, and we're not gonna be able to go out and enjoy our system.
I'll just add to that. So our science team, we have looked at the global climate models that they use to forecast different scenarios of climate change, and we've applied those downscale data to the regional hydrologic model that the water managers use, and what those model outputs show us is that South Florida is going to be drier. Even with no change in rainfall, South Florida will be drier, which speaks to the importance of not wasting water, not dumping it to tide where we know it causes harm. It speaks to the need to store that water when it's in abundance, when it's in available form, and then using that to the benefit of our environment, to our estuaries, to our Everglades. So Everglades restoration, we're finding, is a really important resilience builder in what we're seeing in the face of climate change.
Thanks, Steve. Would you mind getting into how restoration of America's Everglades will contribute to the battle against climate change on a global scale, maybe speaking to carbon sequestration?
Yes. The Everglades is this huge biological system. We're talking a couple of million plus acres of wetland that is really made to sequester carbon and build it up in those peat soils. The problem is we've kept it too dry for too long, and it's become a net emitter of carbon in many areas. So by sending more of that water south, You hydrate those wetlands, you allow for that carbon to be sequestered for those soils to build up, and it actually has a substantial impact. We're talking on the order of hundreds of thousands of automobiles per year that would be the equivalent removal by the amount of carbon being resequestered by this ecosystem. So that's significant. And of course, we know that wetlands globally are being deprived of water. So, you know, the Everglades restoration, being one of the largest ecosystem restoration programs in the world, is really the leading voice and really the example of what we can do to help solve that problem.
Excellent. Thank you, Steve. Do you want anything? Thanks. All right, we only got 2 more questions, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. So in your opinion, this is an open-ended question, what is the most critical need when it comes to Everglades restoration?
Whew, all right. Well, I guess clean, fresh water, right? I mean, going into the Everglades would probably be one of the biggest critical components for at least the southern and central Everglades. You know, a lot of people focus on the southern and central, but there's also a northern portion. So north of the lake is also considered the Everglades, and improving the water quality up there will also significantly improve the ecosystem health in general, but also systems downstream. So I mean, Lake Okeechobee is known for being, you know, high phosphorus, and it's not supposed to be necessarily. And granted, that's going to be a long uphill struggle, but improving that water quality across the system in general, I think, is going to be the biggest benefit.
I was thinking the same thing. Water quality is a huge issue, will continue to be a significant issue because simply there's so much legacy pollution on our landscape, in our waterways. But that aside, the biggest need is money. We need the federal funding to complete these projects that we know will deliver benefits. It's just getting them built.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, and I think, you know, you hear a lot about the science, you hear a lot about the engineering, but what we really need is political will. We need the political will to get the funding, to get the projects done. We know how to do it, we just need to do it. And that takes, you know, political will. So anything that you guys can do to get your legislators to act and support funding for Everglades restoration, that's really what's needed. So that kind of leads me to my next question, which is, and final question before we open up the audience. How can people get involved to support Everglades restoration, and where can people learn more about Everglades restoration?
Well, obviously events like this, right? It's learning more about the problem. A lot of people are just surprised to realize that our water is really our future, and that we waste so much, and so much of it is polluted, and it's just understanding the problem in order to recognize the significance of the solution. I think, you know, being a part of organizations like Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation, the Everglades Foundation, Conservancy of Southwest Florida, we're focused on these issues. So check us out, learn what we're doing to move restoration forward, and, you know, get out and see the Everglades, to know it and understand its importance. You really have to get out there and experience it. And it's just like experiencing the estuary here. When you see it, you see the beauty, you understand how it works, and you know the challenges that we face. They're massive ecosystems, and they really need clean water and these projects to restore them.
Yeah, I think I want to stress getting out and exploring it. I'm known for being knee-deep in water constantly as much as possible. So there's, you know, the good thing about Florida is our ecotourism industry and our environmental education side of things, both from our organizations, but others as well. You know, National Park Service, they have a lot of educational material at all their visitor stations, and, you know, Everglades National Park, Big Cypress. We have our state parks as well that while they're not necessarily the Everglades, they are a chunk of the natural, what's supposed to be natural here, that, you know, the remnant of it, and some of that is reflected in the Everglades as well. So as much as you can, go out and visit those places. They're cheap.
Yeah, and I'll give a plug for Lake Okeechobee. I mean, we often look to Lake Okeechobee as this polluted water body that's always sending dirty water to the coast, but Lake Okeechobee is the beating heart of the Everglades, and you know, it's an incredible fishery, especially when it's healthy, especially when the submerged aquatic vegetation is thick and the lake is doing well. It's an incredible bass fishery, so if you're a fisherman along the coast, you know, go inland, go check out Lake Okeechobee sometime. It's an incredible resource, and we, of course, you know, when we're getting discharges, we're not too happy about it, but I think it's important for all of us to connect with those heartland communities and understand what they're dealing with as well. We deal with a lot of issues on the coast, but so do the heartland communities. Our issue isn't with the heartland communities and farming in general. It's primarily with the politics that are around the sugar industry and how the system is abused for profit. And so I think it's important for us all to remember that we're all in this together, and it's going to take partnerships like we have here with the Everglades Foundation or the Conservancy of Southwest Florida. But it's also going to take partnerships with our inland communities along the Caloosahatchee to be able to acquire the lands that we need to protect the riparian areas along the water, to try and restore and redirect the flows that are going into the Caloosahatchee from the watershed. So it's important to remember that and make those connections with the inland communities because we're all in this together. We appreciate your support, and we couldn't do it without you, and I want to thank you so much for coming out tonight to join us and listen to these folks talk about all of these projects that are just so important to our quality of life here on the island. So thank you very much.